president, not this president, every president always retains the option. I'm not talking about Greenland. I'm just talking about globally. If the president identifies a threat to the national security of the United States, every president retains the option to address it through military means.
It's not just the Secretary of State. The U.S. government is clearly not taking military force off the table when it comes to the desire to acquire Greenland. After announcing the U.S. will run Venezuela, Donald Trump seems increasingly inclined to take what he wants. I'm Catherine Cullen. This week on The House, what does it mean for Canada? The country's former top soldier and a former top security advisor to the Prime Minister weigh in on protecting this country and whether our military alliance could shatter. Plus, does the U.S. grip on Venezuelan oil mean bad news for Canada on trade? And our strategist panel on how Canada's politicians are handling this complicated moment, as well as their take on Chrystia Freeland's messy departure from politics. But we begin with Canada setting up shop in Greenland. The House is now in session. Donald Trump wants to own Greenland. He might try to buy it, perhaps even take it by force. It's launched an international furor, and it comes just as Canada is getting ready to open up a new consulate there, with high-ranking Canadian officials heading over for the opening. The House's own Emma Godmere was in Greenland last year speaking with people there about their sovereignty and ties to Canada, and she's been keeping a close eye on the latest developments. She joins me in studio. Hey, Emma.
Hey.
So, obviously, the temperature is changing a bit here. How significant could this new consulate and this trip become?
Well, it's likely taken on a lot more importance than originally intended. This trip has been in the works for some time and was actually supposed to take place all the way back in November. That's when Foreign Affairs Minister Anita Anand had planned to fly to Nuuk to open the office before the end of last year, but the trip got delayed by bad weather. It's now been rescheduled for February, and now Governor General Mary Simon will be joining. So it's not just Canada's Foreign Affairs Minister heading over there, which is already significant in that it's been years since a cabinet minister has visited Greenland, who we do even share a small land border with. I mean, they're just right there. But now it's also the representative of Canada's head of state going on this visit. Mary Simon, former Arctic ambassador, former ambassador to Denmark. She led ITK, the national voice for Inuit in Canada. She's a proud Inuk. And central to Canada's deep ties with Greenland is this shared Inuit population. So it's hard to not see this trip as sending a significant message, or at least offering some real symbolism to this very close next-door neighbor that Canada has.
Beyond that symbolism, what does the Canadian government hope to accomplish by opening this consulate?
So when I spoke to Minister Anand back in November, right before the initial trip was supposed to happen, her view was that this is key to expanding Canada's Arctic footprint. It's another step in Canada's overall Arctic strategy, and this consulate was essentially on the to-do list for the government that they laid out in their Arctic foreign policy back in late 2024. That policy actually also mentions opening a consulate in Anchorage, Alaska, but no word on a timeline for that one yet. Anand also reiterated her government's focus on defense and security in the Arctic. And here's what's interesting about Nuuk. It's a small, actually a pretty walkable city, population of around 20,000 people, so about a third of all Greenlanders live there. It's the capital, so yes, you have the Greenlandic government and their parliament there, but you also have the headquarters of the Joint Arctic Command, which is Denmark's permanent defense presence in Greenland. So having a Canadian diplomatic presence in Nuuk could be valuable, not only from that government-to-government standpoint, but also on security and defense. Now, the next question, of course, is going to be, can more concrete cooperation come out of this? Will there be more opportunities for, say, military exercises together? That's something that people in the security space are definitely going to be watching for.
Obviously, all of this is happening at a pretty sensitive diplomatic time for Greenland. How are Greenland and Denmark responding to this move from Canada?
Well, it's being quite warmly welcomed, partly because it has been in the works for so long. And just to recap, Greenland is a self-governing territory that's part of the Kingdom of Denmark, right? So Canada and Denmark already have embassies in each other's capitals. Denmark, by and large, handles the foreign policy side of things, though the Greenlandic government has been working to increase their involvement in foreign affairs. They released their own policy document a couple years back that specifically, explicitly encouraged the opening of a Canadian consulate in Nuuk, and they hope to reciprocate with their own office in Ottawa down the line. And also, when I was talking to Greenlanders in Nuuk, there was this real appreciation for Canada being this close ally and neighbor. And a neighbor that understands probably better than anyone else what they're going through, right? There's a lot of fatigue, a lot of frustration around these constant threats. And it's the same kind of deja vu that Canadians have felt around all of that 51st state talk. So as you've seen and heard this week in interviews with people on the ground, you hear a lot of pleas to respect their freedom, respect their self-governance. And next week, we'll probably see that message delivered directly to the U.S. Secretary of State when Greenland's own foreign affairs minister will be there alongside the Danish minister to talk to the Americans about how damaging all of this messaging and rhetoric has become.
Okay, we will be watching next week. The world will too. This House producer, Emma Godmere, who's reporting from last year, you can find and listen to at cbc.ca/The House. Thanks for this, Emma.
You bet.
Do you see any checks on your power on the world stage? Is there anything that could stop you if you wanted to?
Yeah, there's one thing, my own morality, my own mind. It's the only thing that can stop.
Not international
and
law.
that's very good. I don't need international law. I'm not looking to hurt people. I'm not looking to kill people.
Those were reporters from the New York Times speaking to U.S. President Donald Trump. That question of where Trump will stop has become more urgent. Last weekend, he said the U.S. is running Venezuela after American forces arrested President Nicolas Maduro and his wife inside their compound. As we just discussed, Trump has also repeated his desire for the U.S. to acquire Greenland, leaving open the option of military force. The U.S. administration is insisting repeatedly that, quote, this is our hemisphere. So, how should Canada handle this moment? My next two guests have experience making high-pressure decisions about Canada's national security. Jody Thomas was the National Security and Intelligence Advisor to the Prime Minister from 2022 to 2024. She's in our Victoria studio. And here with me in Ottawa, retired General Wayne Eyre was Chief of the Defence Staff from 2021 to 2024. Thank you both for joining me.
Oh, it's great to be here, Catherine. Thanks for having me back.
Thank you.
You have both seen a lot in your careers when it comes to global security. Jody, where does this moment fit in?
Wow. Well, yes, both General Eyre and I have seen a lot, but this is different than I think anything we experienced. We saw, terrible things happen, like the invasion of Ukraine, but they're far more traditional and expected and known than what we are seeing right now. And so it's overused, but it's truly an unprecedented period in world history.
General, how are you thinking about it?
So in 2022, on the CBC, I publicly said that we are at a turning point in world order. And what we see happening is an accelerant to that turning away from the rules-based international order. Hey, every order comes and goes. And if we take a look at the long arc of world history, it's been a case or a cycle of order, disorder, and then reorder. Well, we are clearly in that disorder phase, and the order that we've enjoyed really since the end of 1945, I think, is gone.
And so let me ask you then, how directly under threat is Canada's security at this moment?
Well, the very fact that we are talking about this indicates that, yeah, it's not what it was. And so we have a difficult future ahead of us. There's many plausible future scenarios, but there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty ahead of us.
Mm-hmm. Jody, do you think that people are telling Canada's Prime Minister right now that there is a direct threat to our sovereignty, or is there some other way you would characterize this moment?
I think that the colleagues, the individuals who are briefing the Prime Minister are probably telling him, yes, we have to be very conscious of the fact that we are seeing an unprecedented threat to Canadian sovereignty. And first level of that is the economic threat. That's pretty evident and is playing itself out on a daily basis. The discussion about Greenland is critical to Canada, and Canada has to be aware that we have all the same minerals, we have all the same Arctic access that Greenland does, and if he's interested in Greenland, is he interested in us, and what does it mean for us? So I would think that, yes, those very difficult conversations are happening.
General, Jody pointing out that it's critical because, of course, of some similarities between Greenland and Canada, but the other issue here is certainly NATO. people may know. Greenland is a semi-autonomous territory of Denmark. The Danish Prime Minister has said an American takeover of Greenland would mean the end of the NATO military alliance. Do you share that assessment?
I do. And we have no history of one NATO partner seizing territory from another. The issues between Greece and Turkey may come close, especially over Cyprus in 1974. But this is without precedent. And I share the Danish assessment that, yes, this could be the shattering of NATO, much to Putin's delight.
Mm-hmm. And so, again, I come back to this question of what kind of advice the leaders in Canada might be getting right now. What do you think people would be saying to the Prime Minister about this moment where even just the fact that we have to contemplate this kind of threat to NATO?
Well, we need to be clear-eyed about the range of possible future scenarios. And given that uncertainty, our best hedge against uncertainty is to be able to coexist from a position of strength. And that's not just military strength, but what can we do to strengthen other alliances, to strengthen our economy, to strengthen our institutions of democratic governance, to be resilient against foreign interference and disinformation. And so what we're dealing with here is a system of systems that are tightly integrated that we need to strengthen.
So you talk about this position of strength and our alliances. We can see that Mark Carney is trying to bring Canada closer to Europe. He also has a trip coming to China. Like, who do we need to be trying to get closer to in this moment?
So it's creating a diverse mesh of allies, partners, friends that need to be like-minded enough, where we have mutual interests that are close enough that we can call upon based on the situation at hand. And it's not going to be for every situation, but it's to diversify our partnerships.
Jody, what would you say is the most important thing that Canada needs to be doing right now?
So I agree with everything General Eyre said, and I agree with the tack that Prime Minister Carney is taking. We have to diversify our interests and our alliances and our allegiances. We have to build relationships in places where we've not previously had them. We have to do it on our terms, which means you have a negotiation with China, but you're very clear that foreign interference in Canadian democratic processes is unacceptable, and you put boxes and sort of guardrails around all of that. And we have to build alliances that are stronger than they've been, that are more than just the military alliance and the foreign affairs, foreign relations alliance in NATO, that are truly economic. But equally, we have to accelerate investment in Canada. The Arctic, as an example, and clearly the Arctic is of interest to the United States, remains largely undeveloped. And I think that we have dragged our feet on both military and civilian, and therefore dual use infrastructure in the Arctic.
Why?
And because it's complex, it's expensive, it's difficult to do. And the time is now. And so, there's an example of the Kick port that is on Ellesmere Island, not been invested in. The bureaucracy hasn't moved it forward. And so we are laggards in our own infrastructure. We're laggards in our own development of one of the most important regions of this country. And that leaves us vulnerable. So it is time to rethink not only our relationships, but our own domestic investment and how we are going to ensure Canada can take care of Canada.
I'd like to zoom in just for a minute, General, on Venezuela, because obviously that is also part of the backdrop of all of this, the movements we see from the United States when it comes to other countries. But beyond the general sense of destabilization, do you have any thoughts about what the U.S. action in Venezuela means for Canada?
So I am not convinced that, and like many, that they have thought through the second and third order consequences of what just happened. I was a deputy commander to an American four-star, and I was at a session when he was asked, what is strategic thinking? What is strategic leadership? And his response was illuminating. It's the ability to think in the second and third order effects of actions. And there are many in this case that I'm not, again, not convinced that have been considered. Some of them are positive. Taking Maduro out, let's face it, he was bad, is bad. But what comes next? That is the question. Like I said, there is some goodness in this. Reducing a foothold that Russia and China had in South America. That is good. But again, this shows the decline of the norms of the rules-based international order.
Well, I think that, again, it goes back to infrastructure and what Canada is going to do about our own domestic resilience. And so the impact on our own oil industry, I think, is going to be important, not immediately, but in the future. And so the discussion about a pipeline, which is hard and a complex one in this province, is all the more critical. And so how are we going to invest to ensure that we can safely move product to Tidewater? Some of that investment happened. Prime Minister Trudeau invested in, the Oceans Protection Program and increased the amount of surveillance here on this coast. So it's a complex conversation out here, and it's fraught with emotion and it's fraught with real concern, which I am not diminishing. But there are ways to assist and alleviate some of that concern. And so that kind of investment has to happen. It's going to be expensive, but worthwhile in the long run. And it's time to do it. And so maybe this is going to be an accelerator for Canada's own economic development. Some pain in the short term, but perhaps some real long-term gain.
General Eyre, you have raised many concerns about the military's readiness when you were in charge. How do you feel now?
Well, the move to dramatically increase investment in our country's military is absolutely the right one. Several years too late from my perspective, but regardless, it needs to be done. It should have been apparent in 2022 that the world was significantly changing, and it should not take berating from what heretofore was one of our closest allies, a benign ally to us, to do what is right. And so the right decision has been made. Now it's just a case of getting on with it and rapidly building up strength.
I want to ask you about another aspect of this that you have talked about in the past, which is the issue of internal instability within the United States, the possibility that could spill over into Canada. The example that we're seeing this week in terms of that instability is the shooting death of a woman in Minneapolis after she was shot by an ICE agent. The administration calling it domestic terrorism. We're seeing protests because of it. Tell us what your main concern is about this kind of tension within the United States.
Well, again, when we take a look at the range of possible future scenarios, I would suggest more likely than a direct military threat to Canada from south of the border is spillover effect of their domestic instability. And what does that mean? In terms of us having to strengthen our borders, strengthen our institutions to avoid the impact of that.
What do you think of that assessment by the General?
I agree with it completely. The contagion effect is real, and anger that is playing out on the streets easily can incite anger in Canada. Parallels, there is a faction of Canadians who are very anti-immigration and support the action that's being taken and the philosophy of the Trump government. And so the potential for copycat events here in Canada and protests, I think, is enormous. And it's something that has to be planned for and watched for and understood by both domestic agencies and departments and the national security ones.
Do we have the capacity to do that right now?
We do, for sure. The laws that limit the RCMP and CSIS are really important. I actually think that it's time for a revision to the authorities that both CSIS and the RCMP have. But within the mandate and the legal framework that they both work in now, yes, they have that capacity.
You have actually made the case in a piece that you co-authored in the Globe and Mail over the holidays for a foreign human intelligence service, so like the CIA or MI6 in Britain. Why do you think Canada needs that kind of capability?
Well, I think that, again, it's part of the expansion of Canadian resilience and our ability to stand on our own 2 feet and be less reliant on allies, which doesn't mean that the Five Eyes isn't important, and it doesn't mean that the intelligence we receive and share with those allies isn't important. But we don't know what we don't know. And we don't know what they're not sharing with us. And often no foreign is a tag that will be put on pieces of intelligence. And so we won't see what they're collecting. And so I think we need to be able to do it ourselves. I also think that in the environment we're in right now, Canadians are not necessarily going to be trusting of intelligence that we have received, perhaps from another country. And they want to know if we've analyzed it, collected it, and managed it ourselves. And if action has to be taken because of intelligence, that we have done it ourselves brings more credibility to it in a world that is a bit fragmented and difficult.
And if I can add, much like defense and security, with our allies, we have been a net consumer of intelligence as opposed to a net contributor of intelligence. So increasing our own capacity will strengthen our relationships with other allies.
Yeah.
I do wonder, General Eyre, to the point that Jody Thomas was making about consumers of information. For most Canadians, this is a very abstract idea, right? We imagine some computer system or faceless officials in the United States and the other Five Eyes partners who are feeding this information. For you, the American security and military apparatus is people that you spent your career working with. And so I wonder how much faith you have in that apparatus at this moment as Donald Trump increasingly has his hands directly on these levers.
Yeah, so I worked with and knew 2/3 of the 3- and 4-star generals and admirals that have been fired. I have tremendous concern for them, for my former colleagues, as they face potentially the greatest crisis in political military relations in their nation's history. In a democracy, the military follows the lawful orders of the duly elected civilian government. But when that definition of lawful comes into question, there's not a playbook, there's not a template to follow. So there's some very difficult cases, very difficult circumstances now and potentially into the future that they have to face.
What does it mean for Canadian military leadership? I mean, we are in not only the NATO military alliance, there's NORAD. How do you feel about these relationships at this moment?
Well, we need to continue to hedge, and personal relationships are important. Even as political relations go up and down, the ability to pick up a phone and talk to a counterpart about a sensitive issue is, one could argue, even more important as we face uncertain situations. Even during the Cold War, leaders from opposite sides, military leaders, were able to talk. A lot of these relationships developed over decades, and it would be prudent for us to continue to maintain those relationships as we don't know what's going to be happening decades from now.
Jody, I want to ask you, the Prime Minister is going to China next week. He's expecting to meet with President Xi Jinping. What concerns do you have as Canada is obviously attempting a closer relationship with China after some very difficult years that you were, of course, front and center for?
So I think it's important that he goes. I think Canada has to be in all the uncomfortable places, having all the uncomfortable conversations, and that we cannot exclude ourselves from the world order and certain parts of it. There is no future for Canada that doesn't include relationships with the two largest countries on the planet, emerging economies, China and India. And so by driving the conversations ourselves, setting out the guardrails for those discussions and for what is acceptable in the relationship and what is not, and by heeding the advice he will be getting from national security officials in terms of those conversations, I think that he will be able to manage something really important for Canada. And so I support his going. I know he will be being briefed on where there are concerns, and he is extraordinarily capable and intelligent. He'll be able to weave that into the plans that he makes. I think this is a good move, just as I believe that his rebuilding the relationship with India is a good move for Canada overall. A weakened economy affects our national security. They're tied, and you can't separate one from the other. And so we have to be able to manage both elements of these relationships at the same time.
And so with that, it's another case of how do you coexist from a position of strength. Mm-hmm. If you take a look at Chinese history, Chinese strategic culture, compromise is seen as weakness to be exploited. And we have to go in eyes wide open and ready to do what is necessary in the Canadian interests. And here is where statecraft as a middle power, the balancing act that has to happen, is essential.
General, I want to close with, parts of this conversation, frankly, have probably been a little bit chilling for people. And yet, again, both you and Jody Thomas, you have been in these rooms. You have dealt with a lot of difficult and unsettling information. So I just wonder what thought you would leave people with at this moment, as you say, of churn and change. So
what we're seeing is a return to history. Many of us, our professional experience is rooted in that unipolar moment of 1990 to 2020, when we were surrounded by 3 unassailable oceans and a benign superpower to the south. That was a historic abnormality, and history has returned. You think back to the Peloponnesian Wars and Thucydides and the Melian dialogue, the strong do what they will and the weak do what they must. We've returned to that. But all that being said, if we take a look around the world, Canada is in an enviable spot. We have so much going for us. What we need, though, is a sense of confidence in ourselves and a willingness to do hard things and just deliver and get things done.
Thank you both very much for this conversation.
Well, thanks for the opportunity, Catherine.
Thank you very much.
Retired General Wayne Eyre and former National Security and Intelligence Advisor Jody Thomas. Still to come on the House podcast, if Trump now has access to Venezuelan oil, does that hurt Canada in trade negotiations with the U.S.? I'm Catherine Cullen. You're listening to The House, making politics make sense. Follow us, review us, or tell us what you think. We're at thehouse@cbc.ca.
The oil companies are going to go in. They're going to spend money. We're going to take back the oil that, frankly, we should have taken back a long time ago.
The U.S. now has access to a lot more oil from Venezuela, similar to the kind we produce here in Canada. And that has left some Trump supporters in the U.S. boasting that Canada has lost its leverage in trade talks. The U.S. doesn't need anything from Canada. Free trade is over, tweeted Katie Miller, wife of key Trump advisor Stephen Miller. But is that true? House senior producer Jennifer Chevalier looks at where Canada stands as the two countries and Mexico start renegotiating North America's free trade agreement.
We're dealing with a leader who, like Henry VIII, is fickle, who takes things personally, who has to be literally treated with deference. Otherwise, he will turn against you, literally on a dime.
There's no question trade talks between Canada and the U.S. are going to be rough, says Fen Hampson. The Carleton University prof and co-chair of the expert group on Canada-U.S. relations compares dealing with Trump to being at the court of a famously ruthless English king. So how does Canada approach this moment without losing its head? And have recent geopolitical shifts put us at a disadvantage?
So the markets have been down, both at the sort of stock prices of the Canadian oil producers and the actual Canadian oil price benchmarks themselves have already.
There have been immediate effects. This week, the price of Canadian heavy oil plunged as investors worried Venezuelan oil would overtake Canada's. R.J. Johnson is the Director of Energy and Natural Resources Policy at U Calgary's School of Public Policy. He believes that Canada needs to find other markets for its oil, and fast. But he says it's going to take a long time before Venezuelan oil production can rival Canada's.
You've had about 15 or 20 years of a lack of investment and kind of corruption and inefficiency and looting and deterioration of conditions in the oil sector in Venezuela and in the quality of those fields and in the infrastructure that supports them. And that's going to be a very expensive and risky investment. But even before you can get to that, you actually have to have a government. You need to have a petroleum law, and you need to have a framework for these new investments from U.S. companies before you even start the work. So that's why I think it's going to take such a long time.
And Johnston thinks U.S. companies will need some persuading to take on that kind of risk.
There could be sort of incentives and sweeteners and guarantees from the U.S. government to make it easier for them to go in. But if you follow the oil and gas companies from an investment perspective, they're not as investing as much in sort of big new mega projects and oil supply as they used to. And they like to sort of invest in expanding existing projects or in things like the shale oil in the U.S., which is sort of a lower risk investment. And I think Venezuela doesn't really fit that frame, right? That if they may have $1 billion of spare cash, their shareholder base probably prefers that they spend it elsewhere than Venezuela. But that said, we're in a new political landscape, and Trump is, using the power of the government in a lot of ways.
Canadian oil will be competitive because it is low risk, clearly low risk.
Prime Minister Mark Carney is also brushing off questions about Venezuelan oil undercutting Canada's. But whether or not U.S. companies go in and ramp up production, President Trump may be able to use that possibility as leverage.
He prides himself on being a really good negotiator, and he is always thinking about how to create leverage in any negotiation. And I think it is probably fair to assume at some point when he's talking to Prime Minister Carney or others to say, we don't need Canada. We don't rely on Canada for anything.
Kate Kalukowicz is a former American trade negotiator who worked for Donald Trump during his first administration. She was at the negotiating table when NAFTA was turned into the current Canada-U.S.-Mexico trade agreement. This year, that agreement, CUSMA, will undergo a formal review. And Trump has threatened to walk away if the U.S. doesn't get what it wants. Kalukowicz says Canada's at a disadvantage.
Canada, I think, 3/4 of its exports are destined for the United States, which I think, as a U.S. negotiator, I would know how reliant Canada is on the U.S. And so I think, leverage is a bit tricky in this case. Canada, I think, is going to have to focus a lot on expanding its economic relationships with other economies to show the U.S. that it's not the only game in town.
The federal government is working on it. Next week, Mark Carney heads to China, Qatar, and Davos, seeking new trading relationships. But Fen Hampson says Canada already has some muscle it can flex at home. After all, we're the #1 export market for American goods.
We can buy our cars from Asia. We can buy our electric vehicles if we want from China, from Korea. We can get our agricultural goods from South America, from Mexico. So as a consumer, as a purchaser of American goods, we have leverage and we also have options.
Longtime trade watcher Laura Dawson doesn't believe American negotiators pay any attention to the crowing about needing nothing from Canada by the social media MAGAverse.
Every time I see it, it certainly makes my blood pressure go up. I don't feel like it is something that the U.S. officials responsible for trade negotiations are taking seriously. I participated in the USTR public hearings last month in which USTR Jameson Greer then made a report to Congress on what they wanted to do in the CUSMA review. And while there were things mentioned that Canada could be doing better or differently in the U.S.'s perspective, I left reading that report thinking, okay, the U.S. is committed to continuing with liberalized and integrated trade with Canada. I felt that that was still fairly solid.
Trump is going to feel emboldened. He's going to try to hollow out CUSMA.
Fen Hampson is more worried. As trade talks progress this year, there will be the usual irritants. The U.S. wants to sell more dairy into Canada and doesn't like our new laws about online news and streaming. But Hampson feels that in this climate, now Trump might want even more, like opening up Canada's markets to American banks, telecom companies, and airlines.
There are a lot of things that they could take a run at, and I think we're in a very exposed position.
So what do you think Canada is going to have to concede?
Well, my advice would be not to concede very much up front because, we've already seen when we removed the digital services tax that we didn't get much in return from the administration. I think our biggest hope, quite frankly, is to rag the puck.
But former U.S. trade negotiator Kate Kalukowicz warns that when Trump wants something, a deal won't get done without giving him something.
One thing I would say about President Trump is that when he says he wants to do something once, twice, three times, it usually means that he's going to be looking for some sort of outcome here. So I think these issues are going to continue to bubble up and create problems. It does seem fairly clear to me that it would be difficult for the Trump administration to accept a new extension without some sort of outcome on Canada's dairy program.
It's difficult to say what kind of concessions will be brought to the table during the sort of 11th hour when the horse trading takes place. First of all, a trade negotiation isn't a board game. You don't put things on the table and say, we'll give you some of this on dairy if you give us some of that on another industrial commodity.
Whatever ends up happening at the negotiating table, both Laura Dawson and Kate Kalukowicz are broadly optimistic that the North American Free Trade Deal will be renewed come July 1st.
I think it is not all roses and sunshine. There are definitely things the U.S. is looking for from Canada and Mexico, but I think that Canada can come out of that review in a relatively solid place.
There is strong bipartisan political support in the United States for the continuation of this relationship. I think we will see a continuation of the USMCA, but I expect there to be a lot of bumps along the road as we get toward the review date, and still a lot of challenging moments where the president will threaten to withdraw. But again, I think that the bona fides, the bones of this agreement and its importance to the U.S. economy are widely understood. So for that reason, I feel optimistic.
With all that's happened in just a week, though, the U.S. raid in Venezuela, the threats against Greenland, and a clearly emboldened president, Fen Hampson and R.J. Johnston warn that getting through the CUSMA review is just one challenge.
We're going to be subjected to pressure over critical mineral supply chains, Arctic resources, energy infrastructure, because the United States clearly views these all as core matters of its own national security. We're well on the road to being downgraded from a sovereign neighbor of the United States to a junior resource appendage.
Yeah, look, I think our trade regime, our borders, our military posture, our energy policy are all in play right now. There's no question about that. And the historical assumptions we've been operating on, in the last century and up until, the 1990s and even up until the last year or so are all out the window. So hopefully better days ahead.
The House's Jennifer Chevalier brought us that report. So, we've dug into trade and security, but what about the politics of this moment? We also want to talk about the messy departure of one of the big players in federal politics in the last decade. Time to check in with our strategist panel. Marcy Sirks is former senior advisor to Justin Trudeau, now chief strategy officer at Compass Rose, and Kate Harrison is a conservative strategist and vice chair at Summa Strategies. Thank you both for joining me. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year, Catherine.
Let's start with how the Prime Minister and Pierre Poilievre have responded to this big geopolitical moment, which began with the U.S. seizing Nicolas Maduro. Marcy, the Prime Minister has not criticized Donald Trump for saying he plans to run Venezuela. He hasn't explicitly criticized Trump for keeping the regime in power through Delcy Rodriguez, even though it's fairly clear the opposition in Venezuela won the last election. Are you comfortable with how tepid the Prime Minister has been?
Well, let's be clear on one point, and actually this is transcendent of the two party leaders. Both were extremely clear that Maduro and that regime and that leadership had to go. Canada has not recognized the Maduro regime because it is brutal.
But the regime has not gone.
I understand that. The regime has not gone. We're watching this unfold in real time. But there has been, on both sides of the political spectrum in this country, and for good reason, there has been sufficient criticism of Maduro himself. No one is shedding a tear for the loss of Maduro in Venezuela. Of course, Canada's position has long been, and this too goes across the aisle, has long been that there needs to be change in Venezuela and that Canada would recognize a democratic change and the democratic leadership that has actually been elected in that country. Mr. Carney's statements, the statements of the foreign minister have been careful. You're right to say, Catherine. I'll say careful rather than tepid. They are managing, as are all of our allies, a very delicate situation with the Trump administration. Canada, of course, would be supportive if this was change, and Canada would be at the table if this was the kind of regime change that Canada would be part of. Here, we don't really know what's at stake. It's starting to feel, and again, this is unfolding as we speak, it is starting to feel like Maduro was a bit of a red herring in terms of the Trump administration's true ambition for Venezuela. And that, of course, is why the government is being restrained. We are waiting to see how things unfold. Canada can only participate a bit from the sidelines right now and has to, the Prime Minister especially, has to choose his words carefully. We know how the President seizes on all sorts of statements made by foreign leaders.
Kate, I want to seize on this idea that Maduro was a bit of a red herring. If we accept that premise, then to some extent, perhaps Mr. Poilievre went along with the red herring because he put out this initial statement, very muscular about the departure of Nicolas Maduro, but cheering on President Trump to some extent and suggesting regime change was coming. It's pretty clear now that Trump is not interested in democracy in Venezuela. Did Pierre Poilievre hit the wrong note?
I don't think so. I think that, in the wake of what was, deposing a brutal dictator, it's appropriate to talk about the world being a safer and better place with him being gone. I would also note that the statement from Poilievre did include a call for elections, for democracy, and so I think that was appropriate. What I think is equally important is, what came after that, and in the case of the Conservatives, bringing it back to a domestic proposal and solution. So talking about the impact that this may have on energy markets, which is, I think, really going to be driving a lot of the conversation here as we kick off this year.
But was it prudent to applaud Trump?
I think that we can't, there's no international police force that was going to do this. There's probably no other government in the world that was going to do this. And I think that, it's less about applauding Trump, but looking at the fact that Maduro is now gone. And of course, it was a result of the United States action.
I think what we do have to keep our eye on and what is alarming is the subsequent statements, of course, by the president, which don't align with what Mr. Poilievre called for, which is actually the president guiding himself based on, quote, his own morality, rather than the international rules-based order, which is now the frightening part of this conversation.
Which they've started to refer to as niceties rather than international law. Okay, we do want to talk a little bit more about domestic politics here vis-a-vis Chrystia Freeland, who has made her official departure from politics now as of Friday. She has been one of the most important political actors in the country for over a decade. But there was quite a lot of uproar about her taking this job with a foreign government, with Ukraine, while remaining an MP, and in fact, initially while remaining a special advisor to the Prime Minister on Ukraine. Marcy, why was this so messy?
It has felt like a very long departure for Ms. Freeland, almost like a Rolling Stones tour, another tour being booked. It's like a long goodbye. But look, the bottom line is she has now signaled that the resignation is here. It is time to move on, kind of puts an end to that argument. So I think sort of a short-lived argument from the opposition. With respect to Ms. Freeland, and I've said it on this program and elsewhere, I mean, she is a seminal player in politics over the last decade in this country. I don't think anyone can dispute that point, whether you're a supporter or whether you oppose what she has done. She has high name recognition. She has been behind some of the key policies, including a generational shift on early learning and childcare. I do believe she will be recognized for that, and as she goes off onto more international platforms, her savvy, particularly with respect to Ukraine, will be well respected around the world. So yes, it's been a long goodbye. It is here. I want to thank her and salute her for her service. She has done very difficult work, particularly during the COVID pandemic years, and Canadians should thank her for that.
And yet, Kate, it is ending on a bit of a sour note, given the uproar about her trying to work for one country and another sort of overlapping.
It didn't need to be this way. And I think that there's an instinct to say, oh, well, maybe things shut down over Christmas, or, there was a messy rollout. Maybe Zelensky got ahead of things before the Canadian government could or before Freeland could. But the reality is that she had told the Prime Minister prior to Christmas that she was planning on taking this appointment. There was no news. And then, of course, it came out at the beginning of this year. So that then begs another series of questions about, what type of advice may have been provided in that interim period. It didn't need to be this way, and I think it was because of the domestic political considerations on the configuration of Parliament. We know that the Prime Minister is close to securing a statistical majority in the House. Any change, even in 1 or 2 seats, makes it less appealing for potential floor-crossers, should they be out there, to go and jump in and give them that majority. And so we know that the exit of Ms. Freeland and perhaps other members of the Liberal caucus is being carefully stage managed around that parliamentary configuration. So I'm a bit more cynical and critical on this. I think that the Prime Minister knew very well what he was doing, and in not asking Ms. Freeland to step back right away, which was absolutely what should have occurred, that was done because of kind of the domestic political considerations.
I do want to talk, Marcy, about by-elections in all of this. And just to be sure that people understand, the rules state that a by-election can be called between 11 and 180 days after an MP resigns. But precisely when is something the Prime Minister gets to advise the Governor-General. And so the Prime Minister, in essence, decides here. How would you advise the Prime Minister to handle the timing of by-elections right now?
I'm kind of stuck on what a statistical majority is. As far as I know, in parliamentary democracy, you have majority or you do not. But let's leave that for a moment. Certainly, the question around the arithmetic has been one that has been ongoing for the last number of months. And yes, we've seen floor crossings, again, when they happen, quite spectacular. It's not something we're used to seeing every day. And Mr. Carney certainly hinted at some more potential joiners to the Liberal caucus. They are able to count. Mr. Carney's very able to count, and they know very well that they need not only to get to that 172 magic number, but ideally, and I guess this is where the statistics come in, you would like to have a couple of comfortable votes on top of that to be confident that you can hold confidence in the chamber. So, of course, the by-elections factor into this. We have heard for months that there would be a number of Liberal caucus members resigning. My own advice would have actually been, ideally, for those resignations to have taken place at the end of last year, so that those by-elections could have been called at the earliest instance in this month.
Any sense of why that didn't happen?
I can't speak to why or why not. There are personal circumstances. There are personal lives involved here. I mean, let's not forget, and we're talking about this as bums in seats and votes, but these are actually real people who have careers and family considerations. So I can't speak to any of that. But just from a pure looking at the calendar perspective, yes, I think ideally it would have been sooner, because now we know the House resumes in several weeks. There will be confidence votes in the next few months related to supply and estimates. And, you would want to have your numbers shored up ideally before then.
Kate, is there an opportunity for the Conservatives here? Because at the end of the last year, it certainly didn't seem like any party, frankly, was ready to take down the government, perhaps the Bloc Québécois, but given the abstentions we saw on the budget vote. So yes, we understandably were seized with the numbers, but really, is there any odds that the government might fall, especially given the political turmoil in the world?
I don't think so. And, when we're considering which MPs may be stepping back and resulting in by-elections, I think consensus today is that many of those would remain holds for the government. I think when we're talking about the majority-minority question, it's one that we are going to be talking about after these by-elections are done, because, just to define the statistical majority piece exactly to what Marcy said, somebody gets sick or decides to step back for whatever reason. If you only had a 1-seat or even a 2-seat majority, that's not precisely, the making of a stable parliament. So even if all of those by-elections hold, and let's say, best case scenario for the government, they are successful in recruiting somebody over, is that enough to reliably push through an agenda for 4 years? I would say probably not.
Just very quick point, just in response. It's not only about a confidence vote. It is, of course, about committees and who chairs committees and how you move business through the Commons. So we actually have to think about it a little bit more holistically, and that's where, of course, a majority would help the government immensely with its agenda.
We have time for a quick thought about Mark Carney heading to China next week. Now, he has to walk a line here, I think, where he is not seen as throwing Canada into the arms of China in pursuit of trade, because we know this has been a difficult security relationship. Marcy, one piece of advice you would offer the Prime Minister on this trip?
I think it's very similar to what they're exercising with respect to the response on Venezuela. It does have to be cautious all around. The Canadian relationship with China has been complicated always. It's even when it's been good, it's always complex, as is every relationship with China. This is a first attempt by the Prime Minister to try to warm on some fronts, but let's be real. This is not just about warming it. It's what China wants from us. China suddenly needs to find a new supply for energy. That is the number one thing the Chinese need. They now have a need from us, which shifts the dynamic a little bit in terms of our own leverage. And Mr. Carney will be acutely aware of that. So I think he's trying to feel out just how interested they now are in Canada.
Okay.
I think we need to consider where the country's trade bread is buttered, where it's likely to be, and that's in reshoring our relationship with our largest trading partner in the United States. I do see this visit to China as being high risk, both in terms of what we are able to accomplish or advance, because the domestic politics are very, very challenging for the Prime Minister, marrying the interests of canola farmers in the West with auto interests in Ontario. That is very difficult to manage, but also high risk in terms of what it may signal to the United States about who Canada is willing to do business with at a time when it's very clear where the Trump administration stands on China. And so, I don't want to dismiss the visit out of hand, because he has a political imperative to try and increase our trade relationships. But we have to continue to be mindful of the record of human rights abuses that occur in China. Obviously, the illegal detention of 2 Canadians was in the very recent past. And so I think the Prime Minister will have to marry all of those interests in these conversations and, again, not overcommit in a way that would leave us at a disadvantage with our largest trading partner.
Thank you both for this.
Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine.
Kate Harrison and Marcy Sarks. Okay, that is it for us this week. Our crew on the house is Kristen Everson, Emma Godmere, Benjamin Lopez-Steven, and our senior producer is Jennifer Chevalier. Technical production by Miguel Plant. I'm Catherine Cullen. Thank you so much for listening.